We are talking about Book 9 of the Ethics. Book 9 is a discussion of friendship. Or in Greek, the word here is philia. We'll discuss the implications of this. Brief review where we've been. So, Book 1, we got an outline of the project. Book 2, we got the doctrine of the mean and discussion of moral virtues. Book 3, the first half of Book 3 is a discussion of deliberation and choice and the role that that plays in moral virtue. Latter half of Book 3 through the end of Book 5 is application of the moral virtues. Book 6, we get our intellectual virtues. Book 7, we get a discussion of akrasia. And then in Book 8, we get kind of some discussions of different kinds of people. Remember, Aristotle understands we have vice on the one end, we have virtue on the other end, and then in the middle, we have this phenomenon of akrasia. And as far as people go, we have the virtuous person, the phronomos, as Aristotle calls this person, the man of practical wisdom. We have the continent, the incontinent, and we have the vicious person. The vicious person, Aristotle relates to bestiality, not in the sexual sense, simply in the sense that the vicious person in Aristotle's mind is behaving more like an animal and less like a human being. Why? Because they are failing to instantiate their distinctive human capacities of rational self-governance and understanding. But now we move on to Book 9. Discussion of friendship. If you recall earlier in the series, we were talking about necessary and sufficient conditions for eudaimonia. So we have this phenomenon of eudaimonia, what we've been calling happiness or flourishing, and the necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. We've identified our moral virtue, intellectual virtue, put a bracket around moral luck, because Aristotle is not overly clear on this. This is the example that I discussed when we talked about King Priam, as well as King Priam. But then we also have this fourth condition, and it's not overly clear whether or not it's necessary and jointly sufficient for eudaimonia, or whether or not it's playing a different conceptual role. But nevertheless, it is part of the equation in some way, and that's friendship. Aristotle is going to identify 3 different kinds of friendships. And Aristotle thinks that all 3 kinds of friendships are good. They're choice-worthy. However, they're not equal. So let me get the 3 kinds of friendships on the board now. Then we'll discuss what this notion of philia is about, and then dive into the different kinds of friendships. So the first kind of friendship that we get is a pleasure friendship. Second is a pleasure of utility. So friendships of utility. And the third is a friendship of virtue. Now, this word friendship is rendering the Greek word philia. The word for friend is a philos or philae, depending on gender. And the verb to love is philein. Okay? So where we get our word Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia, it is a agglomeration of philos or philia and adelphos, brother. That's why Philadelphia is referred to as a city of brotherly love, because that's what it literally means etymologically. And this notion of philia is very different. So philia directly translates as love, but Greek has a lot of different words for love. And when we think in English of love, we tend to think of either romantic love, so loving with a partner, or maybe kind of like parental or familial love, loving your parents, family, whatever it may be. But this is not what's going on in the Greek mind when they talk about philia. Philia is a kind of general good feeling that you have toward people. So your friends, we don't say it this way because it sounds kind of weird to people now, but we love our friends. We don't love them to the degree that we love our partners or the degree to which we maybe love our parents, I don't know. But nevertheless, we love our friends. The same thing even with your acquaintances or people on your sports teams or people that you just know casually that you're amicable with. This is philia. This is very unassuming, very non-committal form of love. And this is what Aristotle was talking about here. So it has nothing to do with passion. It has nothing to do with any depth of feeling. It is a very non-committal, just general affection towards someone. And we may think of it as liking them. Okay? Now, the first kinds of friendships that Aristotle identifies is friendships of pleasure. And friendships of pleasure, Aristotle says, while they are good, they are centered around a pleasant activity. So the foundation of the pleasure friendship is the shared activity. Think, I don't know, you're too young for that, so I'm going to use that example. Think about something like someone you enjoy going to theme parks with. Let's say you really enjoy roller coasters. I hate roller coasters. But let's say you enjoy roller coasters and you have a person that you just like going to ride roller coasters with. This is a friendship of pleasure. The thing that is solidifying and grounding and serving as the source or the nucleus of that friendship is the shared pleasant activity. Okay. Now, Aristotle will go on to think that this kind of friendship only lasts for as long as both parties take pleasure in that shared activity. So if the one person stops enjoying going to the theme park and riding roller coasters, then eventually that kind of friendship will dissolve because that shared activity is no longer there. Think about gym buddies, okay? Now, the only thing they do together is they go to the gym together. If one person in that relationship stops going to the gym, then eventually that entire relationship is going to fall apart. Why? Because in a pleasure friendship, the nucleus or the foundation of the friendship is the pleasant activity. It's the pleasant activity. And without that pleasant activity, there's nothing else to ground the friendship. Next, we get friendships of utility. Aristotle takes a fun little dig here, and he says you most often see this kind of friendship amongst old men. Aristotle's got some little jokes throughout the Ethics. And friendships of utility are are very similar to friendships of pleasure. What differentiates a friendship of pleasure from a friendship of utility is whereas a friendship of pleasure is grounded in an enjoyment of a shared activity, a friendship of utility is grounded in mutual usefulness. So think business partners, okay? Business partners are friends, quote unquote. We don't think of it that way. But business partners are friends so long as they benefit one another. And when they stop benefiting one another, that relationship dissolves. So you may have been to think about an establishment that has like a food truck outside, okay? The food truck is owned by a separate individual. The owner of the brick and mortar store may be friends with the owner of the food truck, but they will only be friends or have philia toward the owner of the food truck insofar as, or so long as, the food truck continues to benefit the business owner. But when that food truck stops being beneficial, then that relationship dissolves. So think about it, you could have like a gas station, and in the back of the gas station there's a food truck. Or you see it, there's some of the bigger gas stations that have like independent little food stores inside. That's a friendship of utility. The owner of the gas station has philia toward the owner of the fried chicken joint, whatever it may be, I don't know. So long as that relationship is mutually beneficial. But when the fried chicken joint stops bringing enough business for it to be beneficial, then that relationship dissolves. Okay. So friendships of utility are centered around shared benefit. If you think in terms of biology, these are kind of your symbiotic relationships. Okay, a friendship of utility is a symbiotic relationship where both organisms gain some value or some utility from the relationship. The last kind of friendship that we have is a friendship of virtue. Friendships of pleasure and friendships of utility are kind of in a category together. Call them group A. Whereas a virtue friendship is in a very different category. Call it group B. Friendships of pleasure and friendships of utility are fleeting. They last for a shorter period of time. And while they are choice-worthy and while they are good, Aristotle has no problems with friendships of pleasure or friendships of utility. They're not the ultimate kind of friendship. So if we go back to this phrase that we had been talking about, the pt.1, the what it is to be, or as it comes down into Latin, essentia, into English as essence. If we follow the pt.1 as it refers to philia, then friendships of pleasure and friendships of utility are in some ways caricatures of friendships of virtue. They're not bad, they're not wrong, they're still choice-worthy, but they're not the full representation of. They don't fully instantiate the essence of what a virtue friendship is. And virtue friendships have a couple stipulations. One, they can only occur with people of similar virtue. And two, they can only occur with people of comparable stations. start with the second criterion. What are we talking about? These people of comparable stations bit. When Aristotle is talking about virtue friendships only being conceptually possible with people of comparable stations, what he has in mind is the two partners of that virtue friendship have to be equals. So it can't be student-teacher, it can't be parent-child, it can't be employer-employee. Okay? Aristotle is sexist, sorry, he's writing in the 3rd century BC. They can't be men and women, because Aristotle views women as inferior to men. But what Aristotle wants core to the Aristotelian thought here is that virtue friendships have to occur between equals. Okay? Parents, in Aristotle's mind, are not friends with their children. They cannot have a virtue friendship with their children because there is a disparity in their stations in life. There is a disparity in their power. Okay? You cannot be friends, in Aristotle's mind, virtue friends, with your employer. Why? Because there is a disparity in your rank. If we think in terms of people who are in the military or people who are in law enforcement, something where there's a very clear and well codified power structure, subordinates cannot have virtue friendships with their superiors. Okay, so first requirement is equality of station. The second requirement for a virtue friendship is you must be of similar virtue. Okay? If one person is morally excellent and the other person is riding the moral struggle bus, those two people cannot have a virtue friendship. With that kind of relationship, a relationship of disparity, whether it be disparate because of point 1 or because of point 2, these relationships of disparity, what they devolve into is a mentorship. But a mentorship is not the same thing as a friendship. In cases of friendship, the two parties don't take responsibility for one another. In the cases of a mentorship, the mentor takes responsibility for the mentee. Okay. So, what do these friendships of virtue look like? Aristotle doesn't really give us a very clear, day-to-day picture of this kind of friendship, but he gives us a couple of adages or maxims that are supposed to make sense of this kind of friendship, and he talks about birds of a feather flying together, quite literally. And I take it what the virtue friendship is supposed to be is it's supposed to be two people who are one and the same. Okay? They have the same goals. Not necessarily one could want to do X, one could want to do Y, but they have the same end goal of eudaimonia. They have the same trajectory of achieving eudaimonia, that is through virtue. They desire the same ends. They are harmonious in what it is that they understand to be the good and how to achieve the good. Okay. To use a converse example, because Aristotle thinks you can have, he doesn't call them friendships because they're fundamentally wicked, but you can have this kind of pseudo-friendship, I'll call it, of vice. Two people who are equally vicious can have a pseudo-friendship. Remember we talked about last time when we talked about pleasure in book 7, that vicious people or vice can be associated with a kind of pseudo-pleasure. It's not genuine pleasure because it is not supervening over good function, but nevertheless there's a sensual aspect to pseudo-pleasure. And the same thing can happen with friendship. You can have kind of a pseudo-friendship. Think of Bonnie and Clyde. Okay? Bonnie and Clyde, if Aristotle was around or lived past Bonnie and Clyde, using this case study, would say that is a pseudo-friendship of vice. Because it is two people who have the same end. Their end is wickedness, and they are working toward achieving that shared goal. Okay? And more importantly with Bonnie and Clyde, they spend all their time together. they're a team. If we can flip that toward the good, that's what a virtue friendship would look like. So a virtue friendship looks like Bonnie and Clyde if Bonnie and Clyde were actually good people. If they were virtuous people, if they were striving for the good and working toward achieving the good. Okay? And this brings to an interesting point for Aristotle. In the case of virtue friendships, Aristotle genuinely thinks that these two people need to live together. Okay. Now you may be thinking, why? Why do I need to live with a virtue friend? That seems excessive. But Aristotle sees virtue friends as kind of like two halves of the same whole. They are there to demonstrate their virtue. They use one another as kind of like a sounding board for their own virtue. They do virtuous acts and reap the benefit that comes from it, and they kind of work in tandem, these two friends, to display virtue. It's a way for virtue friends to constantly have an outlet for displaying and exemplifying virtue. And in Aristotle's mind, that can only happen when we live together. Now, we can think in a contemporary society, given all the contemporary measures that we have for increased communication and that kind of stuff, do I really need to live with my virtue friend? It's not overly clear that that's the case, but nevertheless, this is what Aristotle thinks. Yeah. Aristotle is very realistic. He says this kind of friendship is hard. This kind of friendship not only is a constant work, but you're just not, if you even ever have one of these, which is a big if. Aristotle is completely open to the idea that you may never have a friendship of virtue. But if you have a friendship of virtue, you're probably only going to have one or two in your life. These do not come that often. So when they do come, they ought to be cherished, and they ought to be nurtured, and they ought to be invested in, because they are not the norm. The norm, Aristotle thinks, are friendships of pleasure and friendships of utility. But remember, friendships of pleasure and friendships of utility are not bad things. They are just shadows of the best thing, of virtue. They're not bad, they're still choice-worthy, they're just not as good as this. But Aristotle is very realistic that these virtue friendships, they're hard to come by. You may never get them. So a lot of times we just kind of have to make the best of these friendships of pleasure and these friendships of utility. And as a result, we can still have eudaimonia with those kinds of friendships. Now, I think this brings an interesting point for Aristotle, where this is perhaps contentious, but I would maintain that for Aristotle, the recluse can never experience eudaimonia. The recluse, the person with no friends of any of these varieties, can never experience eudaimonia. Why? Because look at the moral virtues: bravery, charity, magnanimity, temperance. These all require social interactions. Friends are a landscape upon which we can demonstrate and refine our virtue. Without friends, there is no landscape or setting in which one can be virtuous. I take it this is Aristotle's point. This is contentious. There is discussions in secondary literature about this. If it's possible to be virtuous in abstraction. I would put it to you that no, it is not possible to be virtuous in abstraction. Virtue requires intersocial relationships. And I think this is why Aristotle understands friendship of any variety as being a necessary condition for eudaimonia. It's not so much that it's a necessary condition for eudaimonia, even though it is. It's more importantly a necessary condition for moral virtue. And because moral virtue is a necessary condition for eudaimonia, kind of like if A, then B, and if B, then C, and if A, then C, kind of a transitive kind of thing going on here. because of that, friendship has to be a requirement for you time and again. It's a requirement because as you maintain, it is a requirement for moral virtue. Okay. That's about all we have for today. On next lecture, we will wrap up the ethics and talk about book 10. And then slight change to the schedule. You'll see this reflected on the syllabus. Syllabi are subjects for revision. Instead of doing Rawls as our final unit, we will still be doing political philosophy in conjunction with other topics, but we're going to do it through the lens of Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic will be, if it either is or will be, I believe I've already posted for you on Canvas, so still no charge to you. And we will begin that series of lectures, which will take us through the end of the semester next week. We'll do same pacing of 2 books a week.